Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to Spellblade Aluriel in the Nighthold.
Yes, this boss takes place in a large courtyard area where you actually get to choose where you want to fight her, and because of this, you don't need too much space in this area and would recommend that you kind of clear out one half of the room so you don't accidentally pull any trash during the fight. But yeah, the fight itself is a 3-phase encounter in which the boss will be cycling through each phase over and over again until she's defeated. Each of these phases will follow a similar recipe where you'll need to deal with a spell which will end up spawning adds which you need to nuke down.
But before we go into each of her phases, there is one ability that the tanks needs to be aware of throughout the entire fight. On a timer, the boss will cast Annihilate. This is a frontal channeled cone attack that will do damage split between two targets, and the primary target while the cast is going off will gain a debuff that increases the amount of damage they take from the boss's melee attacks by 75% for a minute and a half. So when this ability is being cast, you want both your tanks to be stood on top of each other, and you'll want to taunt off each other on 2 stacks. But that ability aside, let's talk about when you first pull the boss. And every time she'll start off in her Frost phase. Now at the start of this phase she'll start to apply debuffs to players called Mark of Frost. Initially this will only be applied to 2 targets, and all it does is ticking damage to themselves and anyone within 8 yards of them. However, each time this dot ticks, it will apply another debuff to that player that simply just increases the damage of the dot, and eventually it will get to a point where that player will be flat out one-shot. So you need to remove this debuff, and the way of doing that is by having both players that have the debuffs to run into each other. As soon as they're within contact of each other, they'll explode, removing the debuffs but also doing a burst of damage to the raid. And importantly, the debuffs will now jump to 2 new players, and the new players will simply have to repeat the process. The only advice we can really give you with this debuff is make sure that you don't just constantly keep exploding them after 1 or 2 stacks, because the burst of damage on the raid is a little bit unnecessary. Let it stack up to say 4 or 5, pair up together, run into each other and then explode. Later on in the phase you'll then begin to replicate these debuffs by applying them to even more people in the raid. You need to deal with these debuffs the exact same way when there are multiple ones out, but you want to essentially just find a partner, find someone that has similar stacks to you, and explode together at the exact same time. You don't necessarily need to have that much coordination because the way that the debuffs come out, they're in a staggered fashion anyway, so you're not necessarily going to have like 10 people all explode at the exact same time, providing you all explode on the 4 to 5 stack range. And again, you want to repeat this process until she decides to detonate the mark. It will make all players with a debuff spawn a patch of frost on the ground. Standing inside these patches deals some damage, but it also slows you, so you want to move out of them immediately. But importantly, you want to try and spawn these patches kind of near the raid, because when the boss decides to animate these patches, an add will spawn out of them. These adds need to be picked up by the tank and brought underneath the boss and just have your entire raid nuke them down. These adds have only one ability. They will each take turns at casting Frozen Tempest. This will teleport them to a random player and spawn a ring, and then it will slowly start pushing back anyone within the circle, dealing a small amount of damage to them. If anyone crosses the boundary of the ring, they'll be encased in ice, which will stun them until their ice crystal is destroyed. So you want to run against the pushback to avoid getting stunned, whilst dealing as much damage to them as possible.
Now shortly after the adds spawn, and hopefully you can kill them off nice and quickly, she will then enter her fire phase. Right at the beginning of the phase, she will mark a player and then run towards them, knocking back anyone within her way. The marked target will then receive a debuff, which will just deal a very small amount of ticking damage. After a short time, she will then replicate this, and she'll summon several ghostly copies of herself, which will each cast this ability on lots of different players. You want to avoid standing in the multiple charges at this point, otherwise you're just going to be knocked all over the place. Now when she casts Detonate, she will cause all of the players with the debuff to spawn a patch of fire on the ground, which will deal some ticking damage to anyone who stands inside it. The most important thing with these patches is that they must be placed at least 8 yards apart from one another, as when she animates them, several fire elemental adds will spawn. These guys will just spam Pyroblast at random players in the raid, which will do around 2 million damage. Fortunately, you can interrupt it, and you really need to make sure that you do. The reason that they must be at least 8 yards apart is that the fire elementals will buff each other if they're close together, increasing their casting speed by 100% and their damage by 200% each. So if they're stacked, random people in your raid is going to be insta-killed by Pom Pyro elementals, which you really don't want. So make sure that they spawn at least 8 yards apart, and then have the entire raid switch to them, nuke them down whilst interrupting their Pyroblasts. If you happen to misplace any of the fire patches on the Detonate, you can grip the adds around with Death Grip, which can help you reposition any adds that happen to be too close together.
And shortly after spawning those adds, and hopefully you killing them off, she will then enter her third form, which is our Arcane phase. Her main ability in this phase is Arcane Orb. What she'll do is pick a random ranged player and just shoot it out towards them. This orb will then slowly move around on the spot, pulsing out damage to anyone within 8 yards. You'll want to make sure that all of your ranged players are far away from the boss at this point. Any ranged players in melee could potentially fuck them over by spawning orbs on top of them, so keep an eye on that, make sure you're not stood nearby. Shortly after these orbs came out, she'll then just replicate them, which just spawns even more. Try and keep away from them. However, just before she decides to detonate the orbs, you'll want your entire raid to stack on a single location. Once the cast is done, all of the orbs will be thrown up into the air, and it's at this point they'll then begin to land one by one on top of a random player's location. Because you're all stacked, you'll know exactly where they're going to land, and it's really important that you get these orbs to land as close to one another as possible. As they start coming down, you want to slowly start to move away from the landing locations. And as they do land, you'll begin to get a burst of damage on the raid. This is a great point to start using personal damage reductions, as well as any healing cooldowns that can be used on the move. Once the orbs have landed, they'll spawn a Pachigo on the ground, which will then very shortly afterwards animate into an Arcane Elemental. These Arcane Elementals will just stand there on the spot and cast Armageddon. After this 30-second cast, they'll explode and deal a huge amount of damage to everyone in the raid, and also knock you back. If 2 or more of these casts go off at the exact same time, it's pretty much a wipe. So by having all the orbs land close to each other, all the patches will form close together, all the patches will be animated into the ads, which are going to be close together, and you can just nuke the living shit out of them before an Armageddon cast goes off. And really, even on your very first kill, it's very unlikely that you're going to see the Arcane phase more than once, as the boss has to cycle through all over again to even get to that phase. It's probably a good idea to use Bloodlust here, and just save cooldowns and just get them out of the fight as soon as you possibly can, so you can then just go back to the boss, and this is when she'll re-enter phase 1. Again, she'll be back in her frost phase, and from that point, the fight simply repeats.
So that's it, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and if this guide did help you out, then do leave a like on it, and of course make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you know when new videos are uploaded. Also, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon for their continued support. You guys are awesome, so thank you so much, and of course we will see you all in the next one.
Thanks for watching.